when you think about it, what could be more fundamental than all of those, for example, than metabolic health? I mean, you've got nutrition on one layer, you've got sleep patterns, and you've got actually fertility here. I mean, metabolic is, I think, kind of fundamental to each and every one of those. So it's super important. Those are some of the things that we'd like to obviously partner and get done, because that's a fundamental physiological parameter that needs to be integrated.
I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think there's such a need for the work that you're doing, actually at all of the companies that you've built. I have a lot of admiration for the kind of the areas that you go into, which I think are often areas that have such great need, but that there's been hesitancy for people to enter, for example, digestive disease. But before we get into that, maybe you could just share your background, what your journey to FemTech was like, and we'll start there.
Yeah, well, thank you, by the way, for that. Yeah, so the journey of that lowly Y chromosome to femtech is an interesting one in that respect. But I've actually always been interested in, and I think looked at the importance of kind of really what I would call three themes. And the first is really continuity of care, and so much of what we have now in healthcare, whether it's digital or virtual, or whether it's in the clinic, essentially, has really been fragmented. And so, I've been a big proponent of trying to promote continuity of care, and that's like I had diabetes clinics, which literally were bricks and sticks facilities, where we actually coordinated the care for people who had diabetes, so they didn't have to go to five different places. And so, and the same thing with if you take a look at digestive, really, the continuity of care, because there's so many different types of services that folks need who have a digestive condition, and the variability of the conditions are so great that it really does require a lot of sort of services. And then when you take a look at women's health, and the reason we got into women's health, originally when I went into Vivante, and before that Livongo, when I went into it, I was really interested in trying to understand and use digital methods to track very subtle immune conditions, or conditions that were really very subtle, and IBS being one of them, of course. They don't have well described symptomology. Well, symptomology they do, but in terms of diagnostics. So with women's health, the reason I got into it is I saw that the market was so fragmented, that there were a lot of point solutions in fertility, some point solutions in pregnancy, some point solutions in maternity and menopause. And goodness, I mean, that's just not how someone carries out their life, right? That was kind of number one. And number two, they were not coordinated. So, once a woman gets pregnant, then do they have to actually find another provider or another service, whether it's a digital service? It seemed kind of absurd. And then the very last thing that I didn't want to do, whether it was the Y chromosome speaking, is that I saw all of these companies were around the reproductive machinery of a woman. And I said that reproductive machinery. They really, didn't create the whole holistic, ecosystem around a woman. So that's kind of the journey, and that's what we wanted to build, and that's what we wanted to provide, a complete sort of ecosystem of products and services at all stages for women.
It's an amazing journey. And for people listening who don't know, IBS, for example, is really one of the most common digestive diseases. It affects, well, you correct me here because my data is probably a little bit old, but up to 1 in 5 people. But nobody talks about it. And I think there's a real corollary there with what you're talking about on the women's health side. Even in fertility, you figure a condition like PCOS, again, up to 1 in 5 women, or potentially even above that, but very little conversation. What was the kind of first moment where you realized that you wanted to work on women's health rather than, for example, going deeper into digestive disease? And I know Vivante continues, but in terms of your personal commitment and time.
Yeah, well, Vivante actually, the Seven Wire, who invested, are really one of our first investors in Livongo, picked up also Vivante. So I guess they like the company. They like our company. So they've got a good farm basis. I think the sort of the realization is when I was really looking at indigestive, and I was looking at, I guess you would call invisible and neglected and stigmatized diseases. predominantly they were really sort of manifested by women. I mean, they were the chronic fatigue syndromes, the lupuses, the fibromyalgias, and it's very often that most physicians, primary or otherwise, actually even GIs on the irritable bowel syndrome, dismiss it as it's all in your head, right? And so a large proportion are actually put on antidepressants and a variety of different things. They have a real physiological substrate. So that's kind of really was the entry point. I saw these women who had invisible diseases. They say, well, you look okay on the outside, but no one really knew they were suffering on the inside. And so when I looked at women's health, I saw the kind of the same thing. First of all, women are so busy. I don't know how you do it. I really don't, honestly. I'm an older person now, and the demands on women are just so incredible. With caretaking families, being professionals, doing all of this. So having to go to 5 different places, to get nutritional support or gynecology support or going diagnostics, I said, this is absurd. And then the second thing, as a physician, you, for example, understand that, almost most of what we know is crazy. Most of what we know actually came from men's health, right? And so the physiology doesn't translate. And so the last thing I'll say on this is that when we started to look at really what are the differences, if you take a look at the genetic level, we're all the same genetically in that respect. It's how we express our genes, number one. But then also, if you take a look at the microbiome, what lives on a woman on the skin and the hair and the vaginal microbiome is completely different. And so there really are unique fingerprints on the physiology that I think we really haven't taken advantage of in terms of delivering the types of products and services that really are specific. So that really excited me to be able to have the continuity and to develop some things that were really specific for women's physiology. I
I
mean, I love the
appreciate that.
biology. The biology is really, the biology speaks, and so that really is important to me.
I so appreciate that. And just as an example of what you're describing, I remember in medical school when we were learning about the symptoms of a heart attack, and there were the kind of conventional and unconventional symptoms. And it ends up that actually the unconventional symptoms are the symptoms that oftentimes women experience. And so there's just this whole terminology around what is normal and abnormal that was really based on medical research based on men. And even within that, men of a kind of narrow racial background. I think if I'm correct, it tended to be white men from certain places, and that just doesn't reflect the entirety of the world, and certainly it doesn't capture the female body fully.
Well, totally. I mean, and if you take a look at, just the statistics, the epidemiology, the prevalence among immune conditions is much higher in women. That obviously tells you something about the underlying sort of immune system. Not worse or not better. It's just different, right? In terms of how it's reacted. And then you have things, for example, like endometriosis that most Y chromosomes really don't couldn't possibly experience or understand, right? PCOS and other types of things. The frequency of UTIs, for example, and things like that, or bacterial vaginosis, some simpler things, but more common. So there are just distinct differences that I don't think medicine is being particularly catered to. And so I think this is a great opportunity to bring this to light,
I completely agree. So let's talk about FemTech. You mentioned wanting to have a solution for a woman's life journey without necessarily being centered completely around fertility or around reproduction. Where do you start in terms of where your solution starts in a woman's experience?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a great question, and we thought a lot about how we do this, and again, it's not unlike really some of what you would call chronic conditions. So we didn't really want everything centered around the reproductive capacity because there are other things. If you take a look at sort of this large sphere, there are things like sort of behavioral economics, really, which do impact. Right, there's a stress factor associated with that. And there really is a gender difference with respect to even, how, behavioral economics and how people manage their sort of life. There's the caretaker sort of voyage too. So that has to be put into the mix because these are all things that are stress inducers, for example. that are also influenced, by the hormonal balances that go through too. So it's it's a complex sort of system that really requires sort of complex things, and it can't be just binned along menstrual activity, for example, reproductive activity, pregnancy,
Yeah.
not pregnant. And so that's how we did it. So we constructed things, at least to start with, what we call journeys. And so, so that they could span, we could get rid of sort of the age difference, right? A lot of the solutions that are out there on fertility say, well, they're only good for people between, this age, and they don't really consider, women who might be 40 or 50 plus, for example. So a couple of them, like sexual wellness is one, right? That doesn't have any age group, and depending upon where that transition is, or any of the transitions, age transitions, there's something along that sort of journey, and at different needs at different stages, of course, that might be hormonal balance. We call it hormonal balance, for example. And that's really different in terms of the adolescence versus someone who's entering menopause. And so we've constructed these journeys so that they actually have the tools and the support, or the ecosystem that supports them. So it's kind of like a sliding scale, if you will. Um, and depending upon the vaginal microbiome, or depending upon their diagnostics, whether they have, AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone, or FSH, LH, we can actually create this ecosystem of products. So we have probiotics, we have vitamins, we have supplements that we've made that actually match the biology of the woman at that stage. Again, it might not be age dependent.
Hmm.
And then we have the services that support that, for example. And so they can easily go from one transition to another, for example, through those, depending upon that sort of flexible ecosystem. So that's what we did. We made it journeys. We've got, wellness. We've got reproductive. We've got sexual wellness. We have UTI and vaginal health. We have beauty, and I'll explain that in a minute, because beauty is a really important component here for us, as part of the wellness journey. And then we just put everything underneath that, essentially, so that we could support them at any particular stage that they were at. So that's how we did it.
Really interesting. And it sounds like then people start with a diagnostic. Tell me what's the initial
Yeah.
experience of a new user?
Well, there, some of the things that we have. Here's kind of the underlying things. We have diagnostics, and the diagnostics come in different sort of flavors, if you will. We do microbiome. So we'll do a vaginal swab from microbiome, or we'll even do a skin microbiome. And so that comes into your box, into your kit, which is really, if you take a look at, they're bold and they're bright and they're really sort of cheerful. And we have UTI, OTC, and over-the-counter UTI. We have bacterial vaginosis, but we do have a microbiome kit, and then we have about 40 different types of individual kits, and five sort of prepackaged kits. So, for example, there's STI kits, there's a wellness kit, there's a sort of a fertility, reproductive, or hormonal balance, I should say. So that's kind of an entry point with respect to questions. We understand where you are. We get questions, and we configure your box such that you'll get a vaginal microbiome. The vaginal microbiome goes to the lab, and we don't overburden you with all of this bacterial stuff. The key items are some of the pathogens that might be there. And then you really want to know what are some of the factors that might lead you. And the vaginal microbiome for STIs, even endometriosis, PCOS, preterm labor, that gives you a pretty good indication, really where you are. And it even does change during menses. So diagnostics is one. We have a telemedicine network. The telemedicine network can do the same things, but that telemedicine network is different in the sense that it's a curated for women's health. We have 900 physicians who are not obese, but understand women's health, to the extent that they understand what supplements might be better. We have a nutritional network of registered dietitian of about 1,600 dietitians that provide actually evidence-based diets. That's a company that we just acquired out of Mass General and Harvard, that have 60 different conditions along that course. And then we have our products, So last thing I'll say on this is that, for example, once we know in the vaginal microbiome, we know what that sort of the ecosystem or that sort of community group is, then we provide probiotics to make sure that we either maintain or restore the normal flora. For example, when you get dysbiosis, oftentimes bacterial vaginosis comes in. Instead of using antibiotics, then we have probiotics that are patented that will actually come in and restore that normal flora. So those are the types of things: diagnostics and the products to match that, plus telemedicine and nutritional type of support together with that.
It really does add a whole layer, multiple layers actually of care that I know from my own experience are not typically available. I'm curious in terms of people finding FemTech and deciding to enter that care pathway either as a supplement to or maybe even, and I'd be curious, as a replacement to their traditional care. Is there an event or something that tends to be the moment when the women say, "Okay, this is the conventional system is not working, and I'm going to look for something else," or how do people find FemTech and start using it?
Yeah, great question. So that there are a couple of things. First of all, we're looking at and we're working actually in the D2C, the direct to consumer market, and that's been facilitated by some of the acquisitions that we've made. Birchbox being one of them, the subscription service,
Congratulations.
and that's where beauty comes in, and I'll get to that in a minute. And the second one is another company called Liquid Grids, which really has a curated network of women in various sort of condition specific types of things and groups. And so we've been able to market and direct to consumer there. It's priced at 99 or around 99. And as it turns out, actually, many of the things that are in there, essentially, some of them actually can be paid on an HSA, health savings account. So there's not a lot of out of pocket in that respect. Some of the things we are trying to get reimbursed right now as in the test. So ultimately, there might be some cash pay, and we find that many women want this kind of concierge service, because they can get scripts included in that, the antibiotics. So the price point is not so high such that it's not affordable with a minor sort of copay or something on HSA. So that's on the direct to consumer. On the B2B, it's an area that we've worked in, our team has worked in with employers and health plans. And most of the services, other than the supplements, which can be paid off on HSA, are really covered under reimbursements. And so they're typical services that are already covered. And like the other business, like I did with Livongo and Vivante, they'll be covered services under those payers, under those health plans. So that's how it'll be paid for.
It's a really interesting model, and I think actually very compelling because, and I think I remember you and I spoke about this in the past, but I really think it's been very hard for these digital disease management companies to find business models that work, where you're having to create evidence, not just that there's clinical efficacy, but also that there's cost savings often if you want to establish a new type of contract with the payer or to get it covered even as part of an employee benefit. And so I think it's a really a nice solution that you're creating a portfolio essentially of solutions, services, products for women that payers have already said, "We believe these are valuable and we will cover them." But you're changing the way that women can find them.
Well, you're absolutely right, actually, and they'll, I mean, they can find us because we're just beginning campaigns to be able to advertise it, but more importantly, on that's on the D2C. So you'll see a lot more of us with respect to sort of marketing on the outside as a direct to consumer. But really, the key, and you know this, that when you go into an employer, sure they want the population to be they want their employees to be healthy, but because they pay for most of the healthcare, they really want to get a return on their investment. And one of the things that we've done, I think, right here, and that's from years of experience, we have a large team of data scientists, about 25, 30, almost 30 data scientists. We're right now analyzing claims from 44 million women over a 6-year period to be able to understand what are some of the markers that precede serious disease so that we can intervene using predictive analytics so that we can come into an employer and say, look, here are the potentially high cost items that you'll see, but here are the current items that you're paying for right now. They don't want to pay anything extra for our service, no matter how good it is. And these digital health startups think that generally think that they'll come in and they say that an employer, or your solution is so wonderful, we'll pay extra. They don't want to pay extra for it. So you have to figure out, and that's why we're really data sensitive, is really where you can come in, understand what the cost structure is, know what your intervention is so that you can save the money, and go ahead and do it and take the risk. And we spent a lot of time doing that. And that's the only way it really will fly.
A very wise investment because I think oftentimes when people are thinking about companies like yours or any of these, like I say, disease management companies, it's hard to imagine the number of haircuts that happen in between, for example, even getting that enterprise contract with an employer and the number of users. And then if you're sharing risk, it's not even the number of users you have, it's the number who have had clinical efficacy or whatever the other outcome is that you're tracking. And it goes from we just contract with a 20,000 employee company to we have 400 users
Yeah,
that we can prove benefit, right? And that's where the money's coming from. It's an incredibly hard thing to do.
it is. You're absolutely right. So, and I'll use the analogy. Really, you really have to have the plane already built before you go into one of these
Mhm,
employers. You can't, So, and you're right. It's a statistical argument to look at the employers. So you need to know what the data looks like when you're going in.
mhm,
And if there really aren't a lot of high costs, I mean, we won't really. It's hard for us to provide value to an employer that doesn't pay very much for their benefits. And so, you might have a great contract with an employer who's well known, but they don't pay very much, right?
mhm, mhm.
So there's no point in doing that because you'll never get there. Versus an employer who really is concerned about their employees and will let you essentially do what you think you need to do on the intervention. And so you have to be really very selective in that respect, and you have to be armed with data before you go in, and you can't collect it as you go on. So you know what it's like, and it's you can spend a couple of years, and you can see that you're at the end, and you really haven't really moved the needle a lot.
Exactly. I'm curious because I haven't been in this world in quite this way in a few years. Have you found that employers have gotten increasingly more savvy in terms of how to analyze and assess all these potential digital health solutions? And I compare that to payers, where, of course, as you know, payers have entire actuarial teams. They're
Yeah,
very sophisticated in their understanding of risk. That's that's their bread and butter is understanding risk. But at least a few years ago, I think employers, especially for solutions for conditions like digestive disease,
yeah,
where there wasn't as much of an understanding or acknowledgement of what the real toll is,
yeah.
has that changed where there's just a lot more understanding of what matters when selecting a solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. You understand that. You understand that a lot. First of all, I think employers are benefit folks nowadays. I mean, I started in this area back in 2004 with diabetes, so they're a lot more savvy. Right? Just because there's a lot more point solutions there, they don't necessarily understand sort of the medicine or the clinical. And then I'll get to that why digestive is one of them. Um, but they understand that they do need to do something to be able to provide a good service to their employees. The health plan doesn't normally, I mean, doesn't always do that. They'll come with some programs, but it is really incumbent upon them. And some of the employers are pretty savvy because they do have actuarials. Either they partner with some of their brokers, and so that's why we as a company, for example, have to be pretty savvy because we have to have all that actuarial analysis because someone's going to do it anyway, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, we better do it right. We better go in there so we know what we're talking about because we're going to, the most sophisticated ones are going to be ready employers. Um, so I think that's really kind of large part that the employers really have gotten a lot more savvy. And on the, like you say, the health plans, I mean, this is what they do for bread and butter. And again, if you're not prepared to go, toe to toe with it on the same set of data, then it's going to be a hard sell. It's going to be a hard sell to come back essentially and give them what the return is. And but as you know, as a physician, again, here's the key. The key is you need to know some medicine. You can't do this as a tech play.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know this really well because, you know, um, digestive disease, it took at least a couple of years to be able to educate people, right? they just didn't know, oh, how could this be a problem? And so you got a couple of years. Women's health is a little bit different, but it takes a couple of years, and you need to understand what the clinical pain points are, really, um, and so you need to be savvy as a company and understanding what really sort of the medicine is um, before you can really do anything, right? The numbers don't mean anything if you don't know anything about the medicine, right? So,
Completely. Completely. It's interesting actually that as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself, this is an interesting example of, I believe that in general, HR and people organizations at employers are still tend to be female heavy in terms of the composition of those teams. So this is actually an instance where you're selling to people who really understand the pain points potentially. And of course, every woman's experience is different in terms of interaction with the healthcare system, but that's actually a pretty unique thing. And the reason that I was thinking of it is because that was some of my experience with IBS is it is so common
yeah.
that when you're trying to sell a solution for that, it may be that it's not on the top 5 priority list for a company, but the person that you're selling to very well may have IBS.
100%, 100%, and that's you hit it exactly right, and that's where you click, by the way, because it becomes a personal experience, right?
Mhm.
And
Yep.
that's part of the education. The other four and that the other four don't get it, but that one does out of the five, right?
Mhm.
But you're 100%. In our particular case, look, we're dealing with 50% or even 70% of the population and an employer who would be female. What's odd, of course, would be me as a guy, and I'll say this right off. I don't understand it all. I don't. There's no way I can. And I don't understand how certain things feel and things. I can understand it from a clinical point of view, and I can understand it from, and that's why in essence, we have all female team because they understand it. Um, they teach me, but I still can't understand it because I can't experience it. Um, so I think that's where we're really on par with some of these employers and the benefits is that they understand each other and they understand where the things that need to be shored up as well. So that's kind of where we're at on that.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that because I think it is so true that you can't really understand an experience unless you are having that experience.
Correct. Yeah.
And it has it been uncomfortable at times, I guess, to be leading in this space as a man? How has that played out? I'm curious.
Well, I'm actually, let's put it this way. I'm led by the women in the company. So I'm just the facilitator to bring everybody together. So I think that's my role. I enjoy it thoroughly. It's challenging at times, no question about that.
Mhm.
But to be quite frank, actually, I mean, I do get frustrated sometimes because I can't understand it because I haven't experienced it. And I'm an experimentalist or an experiential type of individual. So and so I can only abstractly sort of understand it, like doing a bench experiment, right?
Mhm.
Um, so and is it uncomfortable? I think I'm way past anything uncomfortable. I've seen a lot, by the way. Honestly, I've seen, I, I've seen tremendous amounts things I can't understand, but I think generationally they probably fit in the right context generally. But I mean, one thing I think which is important and is I think there's a new revolution in terms of I mean, just like we talked about IBS and things in digestive, there's a new revolution and getting rid of the taboo in sexual wellness.
Mhm.
We call it sexual wellness. It's gone from what I think a lot of folks might have thought was quote pornographic or whatever it is to really getting to a place I think it's not quite there yet in terms of being clinically significant. And there's just not a lot of sort of outcome studies so far on that. But I think it's an important component. And I think obviously there's a lot of physiology with it. There's a lot of things that are associated with it. So I think it's sort of moved that direction. And so that's something that is new to me too.
Yeah, no, it's such an important area, and I think there's been an overall acceptance across multiple fields that this is a core
Yeah.
piece of the human experience, and it impacts everyone in some way, um, in so many ways. And It really, yeah, it's I so appreciate that you're pulling these things into the dialogue because like you say, it takes years to turn the tide. And you have to start somewhere.
Yeah. Well, well said. You said it. It really is part of the human experience. I'll tell you one of the interesting things, and I firmly believe it. But I think this would be a very high mark for an employer. There is indeed a very extensive literature in terms of sexual wellness, for example, and productivity at work, and that's one of the things that's really important for absenteeism and productivity, right? And so that's a type, so that's kind of it's a correct sell, to be honest with you. It's a hard one to sell because it's still taboo in that environment where you would say, listen, sexual wellness is really important aspect to increase the productivity. But there is good physiological, there's good literature, scientific literature, peer-reviewed literature that actually speaks to that. But it's a hard one to introduce.
It is, and I would think that there's also a lot of interesting interconnections here to other areas of health that are known to be important, for example, loneliness. And that's not to say that loneliness is
Totally.
necessarily completely connected, but in any individual's experience, there's a lot of crossover in terms of mental health, sexual health,
Yeah.
just everything is interconnected. And I think, like I said, I hope that there's an increasing awareness that that is the case. And even at levels, not not to plug levels, but our feeling is that metabolic health, it links to mood. It links to everything.
Well, you're on the right path though too. I think that's good. I think that's a great example. What I think Levels has done here too. I think it's a really good example. Look at a continuous glucose monitoring was really was and we were actually with some of the Dexcom and Minimed, some of the original users of that. It was actually only applied to what you would call chronic disease, right? And when you think about it, by the way, and you know this better than I do, when you start to think about it, why would it only be disease? Well, I guess because people with diabetes needed to control their blood sugar. But isn't actually metabolic control sort of fundamentally, what we do in our physiology all the
Mhm.
time? We
Mhm.
ingest stuff, it gets converted through all of this, and this is what we do to make ATP and to do all the things that we do. And so, why wouldn't we want to monitor this? Why wouldn't we want to monitor other sort of electrolytes? So, I think it's an important, I mean, it's like a fundamental principle. So I think what you're doing at Levels is bringing it into the mainstream of that rest of the 90% of the folks who really need to benefit it as part of their daily lives. So I think it's important.
I agree. I'm very biased because this is where all my energy and time goes, but I agree. And I'm curious, is there an overlap of metabolic health in terms of FemTech right now and the solutions that you're offering?
Well, yeah, to be quite honest with you, this is really important. I mean, it's really important, it's fundamental. And so I'll put it in the context of the way we're thinking. First of all, I mean, if you think about the products that we have, our supplements, vitamins, probiotics, and all that, think about it, the company that we've acquired that's joining us that is actually using evidence-based nutrition that have outcomes, clinical outcomes for 60 different conditions, including PCOS, reproduction, all those types of things. That's obviously important when you're not well and when regular meds don't work. And then when you think about, we've got devices. We've got a device that it will measure heart rate variability. It'll measure temperature. We're using it for ovulation right now, ovulation frequency, and sleep patterns. When you think about it, what could be more fundamental than all of those? For example, than metabolic health. I mean, you've got nutrition on one layer, you've got sleep patterns, and you've got actually fertility here. I mean, metabolic is, I think, kind of fundamental to each and every one of those. So it's super important. Those are some of the things that we'd like to obviously partner and get done because that's a fundamental physiological parameter that needs to be integrated. So yeah,
I agree. Yeah. No, I agree, and that's a lot of where I spend my time, at Levels is just thinking about what this interplay is between what we would think of as conventional clinical conditions and these underlying metrics of health that really are the foundation, I think, of all of this. And you mentioned microbiome. I'm curious, how does that work? Is that something that people do when they first join, when they feel like it throughout their experience? And how does that intersect with then the products that they choose to select?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So they can do it throughout each of these sort of voyages. But let me give you one really good example for some folks, for some women, for example, who might have recurrent UTIs. There's a very distinct fingerprint, if you will, for that dysbiosis of the microbiome, the vaginal microbiome. Okay. And so we've developed certain formulas, proprietary formulas with ingredients, if you will, and strains that have been clinically shown to be able to stop and or reduce that sort of recurrent UTI. So you can restore that so that you have vaginal microbiome that is more resistant, rather than having to think about doing something else and using antibiotics. Same thing with bacterial vaginosis, and that really is a dysbiosis. There's a particular strain that keeps the vaginal pH at 4.5, as you know, right? It produces lactic acid. When that one gets out of whack, all the other bacteria, because they like the higher pH, start to grow, and there you go. You start to have that issue. And so we have a formulation that actually will restore that ecosystem and start producing lactic acid by the symbiotic bacteria there. So that's why we would do a microbiome test essentially, and then match the therapy. I mean, we can always go to antibiotics, but to match the therapy to restore the normal sort of ecosystem. Um, yeah, but getting back to metabolic, for example, I think it's really, I think it's fundamental, and I think what you're doing is extremely important, because and using this type of technology, by the way, here's where I think it's going to ultimately be super important. You're going to get a big enough end, you're going to get a big enough, it's like, having millions and millions and billions of Holter out there. When you can start to apply AI and machine learning to example, to find out what are really the outliers when, in the metabolic, and to find out what are some of the biometric signals that you would have never seen before if you had done spot testing. So I
Mhm.
think what you're going to see is you're going to figure out some metabolic variability by this large statistical, and that's going to be extremely valuable because they're going to provide really good places to intervene. So I think that's super exciting on that 90% who already haven't been diagnosed with a
Mhm.
chronic disease.
Mhm. I completely agree. And are there specific areas when it comes to metabolic health and women's health? We've talked a little bit about PCOS. Are
Yeah.
there other areas where you suspect there's a lot of improvement to be had from understanding someone's blood sugar control and then modifying it?
Yeah, well, so PCOS is probably the easiest because there's insulin resistance that comes there. But I mean, I guess the long and short of it is that we really don't know enough about the patterns, I guess. I mean, well, look, I think the next one would be cardiovascular conditions, right? Cardiovascular disease is pretty obvious, and kidney disease and things like that, kidney conditions. Um, and there's a literature out there because we've looked at it. On two things. I mean, and I'll tell you, it's sort of the corner cases. Skin health is really a big one. Because what happens in people, not only women, who have really high A1Cs, like 14 and 15. Their skin gets it's glycosylated. The skin so the sort of whole texture. So skin health really changes a great deal. So that'll be another one. And I think, as you probably know, in terms of the physiology, when you get spikes, you get changes in the hormonal level as well. So I think, I don't know specifically, but I think they're going to drop out of this, and I think it's going to be really important to find out how metabolic control can control skin health, for example, and other types of things. I think that's an exciting area, actually.
I do too. And I think what you said about needing large scale populations to study this in, where we can move past just saying someone does or doesn't have a PCOS. For example, to say, actually, like you said, when you spike your blood sugar, well, maybe that was linked to a cortisol spike and that then impacted your sleep, right? Like these things are much more nuanced than I think our current medical terminology can
Totally.
capture.
Yeah, totally. That's a great example about cortical spike and sleep. And you'll be able to pick that up and be able to look at sleep and things. And so there's some very specific areas that you'll pick up, and I think that'll improve sort of the general health. I don't think it's entirely and you know this better than I do, of course. I don't think it's really entirely about glucose control. It's really what your metabolic system looks like relative to all the other types of things that are going on physiologically.
I agree. And your comment about skin is so interesting. One, because I think the physiology is so interesting. And two, because oftentimes beauty and some of these more aesthetic pieces of the underlying health condition are actually, I think, what can get people motivated to start to make changes. So they're really important. And not to say that beauty in general isn't important depending on what any one person prioritizes, but I think it's such a powerful way to create behavior change sometimes. And I'm curious, you've mentioned beauty a couple times in this conversation, and it sounds like you mentioned the acquisition of Birchbox. I'm curious what FemTech is doing in relation to beauty.
Well, yeah, some people in the healthcare area said, well, why would you want to buy a subscription in terms of beauty? So I think the sort of and it's been fascinating, and it's been incredibly rewarding and fun. It's just been amazing. Eye opener. I wanted to do two things on this. First of all, I'm a big believer in that, beauty, and not just cosmetics, not just this transactional stuff, is really a continuum of who you are and how you perceive yourself in terms of your wellness and or your illness. And you don't, I mean, our perception of beauty is it shouldn't be, and oftentimes it is, in terms of shapes and sizes and all that. And if you take a look at our branding and stuff, it's an expanding of the microbiome, and they're different shapes, and they're different oblongs and obtuse and things like this. And so it shouldn't be body shape. But in terms of, and there's some good clinical evidence, in terms of how people perceive themselves, in terms of whether they're well or not, I think there's a continuum. So I think there's a great opportunity, just like you said, that it's a great entry point in terms of engaging and motivating people, not only on the routine side, but also on how they actually feel about themselves.
Mhm.
Um, and we did a survey in the Birchbox, we have it, and almost routinely, people said, well, why don't you put on cosmetics? And then they said, I feel really good. I feel confident. I feel proud of myself. I have more self-esteem. And that's a great entry point for healthcare. Honestly, I mean, when you take someone, for example, who might not be well, one of the first things you need to get them back to a place where they actually feel good about themselves. You can't operationalize that. So that's why we purchased it, and that's why we acquired it, and that's what we're trying to change, essentially bring in the beauty into healthcare and a little bit more healthcare into the beauty aspect to make that continuum.
This is really a full circle moment for me because years ago when Birchbox first started, I was working for a venture capital firm and it was a seed firm and actually pre-seed. And we were looking at Birchbox and I remember going to their very, very early website and we were just thinking to ourselves, okay, $30, I think it was $30 a month for a box of beauty products. And that idea of a curated subscription box was still very new, actually. And I remember trying to figure out the business model and whether people would pay. And so to hear that now you've acquired it and you're really using it to put towards health when thought about in a very holistic way and really as an accelerator for people to start on their health journey, it's really exciting for me. And I think I'm really excited to see what you do with it.
Well, it's fun. We have over 200,000 women that we're providing products to every month. So that's been really good too, because it gives us an opportunity to listen. We haven't always listened probably in the best way. We've made mistakes, but I think we're getting better at that. To be able to use that community, they're engaged, to be able to start giving them products that actually work. That's the one thing that I saw in this market, that there are a lot of sort of cosmetic products. If you go to the stores, Sephora, Ulta, and those types of things, they're just an overwhelming number of products. But because we've been focusing on healthcare, we're just like you. You have to be outcome driven. We don't want to sell products that we don't think are going to work, and so we've changed the model such that we're really going to be insistent on products that actually work for you as an individual, and work on your biology. So to me, that's really exciting,
Mhm.
to be able to bring really good products to women that actually have outcomes.
I agree, and it sounds like you're really I mean, your product offering is really expansive. It's very impressive, and many of these are synergistic with each other, like you said. And I'm not sure exactly how the tracks work, but I would imagine that someone could be on a, let's call it PCOS track, and also on a beauty track. I
Totally.
and right, and those two actually play off each other really well.
Totally. Honestly, there are folks, women, for example, that have PCOS. You wouldn't know that they have PCOS, because normally some people associate PCOS actually, with clinical obesity, for example, right? But that's not always the case, actually. And so, by and large, we've heard from a lot of women who have PCOS that the beauty aspect is really an important aspect. And so, you hit it exactly correct, exactly correct. And so, I hope we can make inroads there because I think it's an important problem, and I think well deserving sort of community there. So,
I agree. And I think there's so much emotional energy for women, and I'm sure for men too, but not being a man, I haven't experienced that. But collective emotional energy that goes into all of these things that we've discussed. And yet there's not really a very public dialogue about it. And to your point, there hasn't been much resourcing. And even when you look at venture funding for, I guess what we traditionally call women's health or FemTech, it's been very little, and it's rapidly increased in the last couple of years, but it still makes up a tiny percentage of overall funding, especially when you take out things that are related to cancers and specifically breast cancer. It gets even more, a much, much smaller piece of the puzzle. So I think it's so important, and I'm so glad that you're bringing it to the forefront.
well, thank you. It's been, look, I have I mean, like any of the things, it's true. I have a really great team. I have a really great women backed team. Ultimately, we will bring on a woman CEO for the reasons I explained. I can't get it, and I think this area deserves a spokesperson who really can use this podium and this platform. But our team is really, and not to brag too much, our team has really done a marvelous job. I mean, we started this in May of 2020, um, and so we started in 2020. I was able to bring on some extremely talented women from some really great places. They've done a tremendous job. Um, it oscillates. You've been in startups, and you are now. It oscillates between moments of incredible joy and chaos, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and you set these deadlines, and you get these deadlines because you've got to launch, and then you say, "How am I possibly going to make this?" But guess what? You do, right?
Hmm. Yep. It's interesting because I was listening to a podcast recently about running, and I think this was what Ryan Hull said, the famous American marathoner. And he said, everyone always says it's a marathon, not a sprint. But what people don't understand is that oftentimes at any given mile of a marathon, it actually is at sprint pace. And that really spoke to me in terms of startup life, because it is a marathon and a sprint, especially in healthcare, but every
Yeah.
mile is its own sprint. And I'm sure you've experienced that as well. And I'm curious on that note, and also this is just thinking in terms of potential partnership or ways that we can collaborate. Do you have a research arm or kind of an area of the company that's focused on doing, like you were mentioning, some of those larger scale data science
Yeah.
efforts?
Yeah, we do actually. So, we do have a large data science team that's doing this, but we do actually have two IRBs there, approved IRBs. We're doing a study right now in a large population, and that's partly where Liquid Grids has really been, or that community has been really good because they have curated communities of women like cardiovascular, PCOS, they have cancer, they have a variety of things. So we're doing a plus and minus HRT study to take a look at some menopausal interventions right now, and certainly looking at the microbiome of plus and minus HRT, and so that we can apply a certain. Um, and we have another study with another institution, which will be announced, that's looking at IVF. The one of the concerns, obviously, it's a big concern, is that multiple attempts at IVF are not only really very difficult for the family, they're extremely difficult for the family. So that's why we do have some behavioral health to be able to help for those failures. but they're also very costly for an employer. And so the question there is that what are some of the markers and some of the things that we might be able to do to reduce the risk of failure? What can you do to help? What is sort of some of the background? So we have a couple of studies going on right now, and so to get that type of data, that's what we're doing on the
It's
clinical.
amazing, amazing. These are all areas that have not gotten a lot of funding and that are so important, and and luckily increasingly being recognized as employers. And like you said, from by employers. And I think the impetus for that is money and cost.
Yeah.
But that's okay because they deserve attention. And from my perspective, whether that comes because employers want to reduce the overall cost or whether that comes because of some other forcing function, at least it's getting studied.
Well, yeah, and so listen, with levels and metabolic control as well. I mean that I think it's again coming into an employer, for example, and you know this from digestive. I mean, it's coming to an employer and say, well, listen, I want to do metabolic control. Well, why? I mean, where is that? And so, I mean, and so what does that really mean? And so you craft actually the offering and the argument, if you will, and the offering around that. And so there's some education. And so when we come in terms of partnering and things with metabolic and potentially with levels, what we'd want to do essentially is make part of as a whole package. Do you understand that it's a continuum essentially? They should look at this because it's really important. Well, yeah, here's a specific problem we're applying it to, but just here's all the other mass where it could be applied to as well, right? So I think that would be I mean, I think that's the objective is how do you bring a solution like yours essentially to an employer, to a health plan? And I think the first vehicle is really to show the importance of it, to show that it actually can hit the larger population. It's like doing digestive, I mean, if 50 or 60% of the population, you need to educate the employers in terms of the importance of it. So that's where I think a partnership is meaningful. Where women's health is a big category. It shouldn't be refused, actually, women's health, and so you can bring in these that shouldn't be, but
It
no,
shouldn't be.
yeah, right,
No, it shouldn't be, and I think my numbers here are probably dated, but I remember looking at this a while ago in terms of most expensive acknowledged conditions by employers in terms of how they do their accounting of cost. And on the women's health side, it was basically pregnancy
it
was
is.
the expense. And like you said, that really just captures a fraction of any woman's experience. And it's pretty amazing that it's taken this long. And I so appreciate your work on it, like I've said many times, because this is not only my experience, but also the experience of many of my close friends and family.
Yeah,
And like you said, their families. I
yeah,
have many friends right now who are doing IVF, and it's incredibly hard on everybody.
it's really hard. I think you mentioned it as well. So I think yeah, it's yeah. I mean, there's so many just different areas that need to be touched. That's certainly certainly an important one, I think, as well. So anyway,
Yep. Yep. Well, and I would of course be interested in terms of how metabolic control and metabolic health plays into success rates and some of them. I think there's significant reason to think that lowering insulin resistance, improving glucose control
worse.
improves outcomes and improves fertility in general.
Oh,
But
worse.
but it would be nice to prove that in a real world setting at scale.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, in sort of finishing up on this, is that how can it not help? I mean, you have to ask that question. I mean, why wouldn't you want to understand the metabolic control during pregnancy, for example, or even during an IVF? Well, why wouldn't you want to? I mean, it again, I think it's so fundamental that I mean, yeah, just so fundamental. It's that it why wouldn't it impact actually fertility? Why wouldn't it impact pregnancy? Why wouldn't it impact lactation? Why? I mean, it absolutely has to, and it does. So
Mhm.
it's fundamental, right?
I agree. I agree. And this is probably a good to be continued moment because I would love to chat more about potential
Yeah.
collaborations, ways we can partner, I think what we're doing is very synergistic, and
It is.
and even from a pure science perspective, there's so much to be learned, and it's important. It's critical, really.
Yeah, I think it's really important that I think we need to bring your solution in. I think we need to do this. I think we need to make sure it's part of all of the journeys. For example, fertility, just sort of general wellness. Things. For example, along any of these pathways. For example, I think it's really fundamental. So I think to be continued is really our next steps, and they will be continued.